Hi, and welcome back to the fourth installment of our five-part webinar series, The Blueprint of a Strategic Demand Marketing Plan. I'm once again joined by our panel of expert guests, Chief Operations Officer Jennifer Harmel, Chief Growth Officer Jessica Jones, and Senior Strategy Director Jen Watson. Today, we are discussing the importance of establishing a framework for managing your funnel, how to align your sales and marketing teams, and exploring why you're not getting the ROI you expect from tech purchases. So to kick us off, Jen, can you start by explaining what funnel management framework is?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I love talking about this one because it is such an important foundational piece of demand generation, because really I think that it leads to no lead getting left behind. That's the idea with your funnel management framework. Nothing is going to get lost between the sales and marketing shuffle. So funnel management framework, or sometimes referred to as a lead management framework, it's a clearly defined process for how and when leads move through a sales funnel. It drives alignment between sales and marketing. And the really great thing about it is that it creates a mutual accountability between your sales and marketing organizations, which is extremely important in demand generation. And the whole point of a funnel management framework is to drive higher quality leads and to optimize conversions of your leads. So there's a lot that goes into it. It answers critical questions like what are our lead qualification stages? How do we determine when a lead is ready to progress or to convert to the next stage? What makes a lead qualified or sales ready, as we sometimes call it? Who's responsible for what, and when are they responsible for doing it? Questions like what happens when a sales progresses through the sales funnel, but it's premature and for some reason they're not ready to be at that stage. Maybe they're not sales ready yet. What do you do with that lead? So it answers a whole host of really important questions that feed the entire demand generation process. And there's a lot of different elements that together make up the funnel management framework. And I'd say one of the most important things is having consistent definitions of what the lead stages are. So for example, a qualified lead, everyone needs to be aligned on what that means to be a qualified lead. I've worked at organizations where there is not a standard definition of a qualified lead, whether it's a marketing qualified lead, a sales qualified lead, whatever acronyms, MQL, SQL, people use to define it. That's great, unless you don't have a universally accepted definition. So a qualified lead should be a lead who meets predefined buyer demographic criteria. So that could be everything, anything from job role to job function, company size, industry, that basic demographic that makes up your, ideal customer. But also a qualified lead should be one whose behavior indicates that they have a high propensity to be in a buying cycle. And that behavior could be any combination of filling out online forms, downloading content, visiting web pages, a whole host of behaviors that are all pointing to the fact that this person is clearly in some type of buying stage and they're moving through that buying cycle. So it's also, for a qualified lead, it's not uncommon to have different types of qualified leads. Sometimes you've got qualified warm, qualified hot. Each of those need to have their own definitions. And again, like I said, the key is that everybody shares those definitions. And I can't stress that enough, because we have had a lot of situations where organizations are wanting to measure the performance of demand generation programs when they come to us, but they don't have common definitions. How can you possibly measure the success of a program if you're all using a completely different definition of what success looks like? Anything to add there, Jessica? Did I miss anything on those, or Jennifer, on those definitions?
No, I think that's pretty, I like that you called out the fact that there are different types of qualified leads, I think, because it indicates that you're going to have to approach them in different ways, right? So somebody that's a QL warm, let's say, who's through their behaviors, they're not an overt hand raiser, as we like to call it, right? They haven't said, yes, I want to talk to sales, and filled out that accelerator form, right, that we always recommend on websites. I think that's really important because from a BDR perspective, right, you're going to approach them in a different way. It's a different kind of conversation. It's either having this, like you said, being likely that they're in an active buying stage and ready to talk to sales versus saying, I actually want to talk to sales. So it's a very different conversation. So things like that are really important.
Yeah.
That,
And I like that you, speaking of BDRs, I like that you mentioned a little bit about like the conversion process, right? Because the funnel management framework isn't just about defining the funnel or specifically defining the lead. It's the what and the when that you mentioned that's really important. You know, it's a shame when you see organizations and marketing in particular go to all of this effort to fill the top of the funnel, right, and nurture things to at the point of becoming sales ready, and then the leads just sit there for 24 48 hours, and as we all know, they grow cold. So that process, those service level agreements, clearly having teams in place and clearly articulating what their responsibilities are is equally important.
It's interesting you said that too. I think one other thing that we forgot about was it's not only what you should do, but what you shouldn't do, right? So I think that understanding what stage they're in, to your point, Jen, is also when you shouldn't be reaching out to them, because reaching out to them as a sales rep is actually going to create a point of friction, right? If they're not in a stage where they're ready, it's a passive buying stage, for instance. I know oftentimes we see organizations when they're missing their numbers say, well, let's just look at these leads that are a little earlier in the
Open the floodgates.
Just open the hose, right? But it's not doesn't work that way.
Send me all of them.
They're literally telling you that they're in a stage where they're exploring things and they prefer to do things from a self-serve, right? They prefer to be self-sufficient at that stage and not talk to sales, and sales is asking to talk to them. So I think that's important too, right? It's not only what you should do, but what you shouldn't be doing.
yeah, that goes back to what Jennifer was just alluding to with the conversion process, having a well-defined conversion process that outlines all of those logistical steps, the who, what, when, how of converting leads through those predefined stages. So, again, it comes back to all those questions that you have to answer about your process. What field or fields in your CRM need to be updated when you're converting a lead? Who's responsible for updating those fields? Is it a BDR, LDR? Is it a salesperson? Who has ownership of that? And how do you know when it's the right time to convert something? So those are all the components that feed into that conversion process, that is making sure that you're having the right conversations at the right time, and that you're not, to your point, Jessica, reaching out prematurely, which is so off-putting. We've all had it happen before, where I know, Jessica, I've seen you post on LinkedIn recently, thank you, Mr. Salesperson, but no, stop reaching out to me.
You've downloaded one piece of content. You must be ready to talk to sales, even though it was thought leadership and mentioned in no way, shape, or form any type of product or service.
Right. And we've all been there.
Yeah.
And that brings me to another point, which is another really important part of funnel management framework, which is progressive profiling. And this is such a great way to make sure that you are having those conversations at the right time, when the buyer is ready and in the right state, the right frame of mind. So progressive profiling, I know a lot of people who don't have a robust demand generation program may not know what this is. I know that when I was a client of Annuitas before I came on board as an employee, I did not know what progressive profiling is, and it's a really great systematic approach to gather information about a prospect or a lead without asking too much at one time. And that way you can use that information to shape the conversation around their needs and at their pace too, which is an important part of it. Like we've talked about, they're setting the pace, you're not setting the pace. So progressive profiling helps to make sure that you're doing that in an effective way. So we use progressive profiling on forms that provide access to gated assets. And I like to think of progressive profiling as kind of an exercise in trust. And I think we've all used this analogy of dating before. You know, you don't go into your first date and put all your, not that I would know, I haven't dated in 30 years because I've been married, but from what I hear and what I understand, you don't want to put all of your cards on the table on the first date. You know, you don't want to ask everything, you know, oh, well, how many kids do you want to have? And, you know, ready to get started on that? When are we gonna, you know, when are we gonna get married? When are we gonna start having kids? You know, there's a time and a place for everything. So with progressive profiling, the lead, they want your content, your asset, whatever it is. You ask, you know, 3 to 5 unobtrusive questions. They get access to your amazing content. Now they're more familiar with you. There's a little credibility, there's a little trust. And so the next time they come back for more content, they're willing to answer a few more higher value questions that are going to, you know, really help you make sure you're progressing them through the funnel in a way that makes sense and that fits their pace.
Yeah, and we talked in a previous session about the content model, and I think it's really important here to call that out as well, which is that people are also willing, because we hear a lot from clients talking about, I would say forms are one of those hotly debated topics with organizations. People, you know, I've actually gone into organizations and they've been like, well, we ungated everything, right? Because we don't want to create points of friction with the customer. It's like, okay, well then how are you personalizing? How are you learning things about them? How are you, you know, so it's actually creating the opposite, which is it's creating a you know, a generic experience for them because you're just banging on them with, I see it in a lot of product-led growth organizations, right? Where they're just trying to drive people to demos. They just don't, just here's all a litany of content or things. But I think it's important to call out that, you know, if you have a content model that is clearly aligned to a buying journey, and therefore you know, you're offering people assets that are of value based on where they're at in that journey, they're willing to give you information, right? So it all works together. It's you have a valuable piece that's going to align with where they're at and solve the challenges they have in that moment, and you're asking questions that don't create a lot of friction, that make sense. And again, to your point, Jen, are meaningful piece of information, you know, based again where they're at in that buying stage. Then it's a non-starter. It doesn't matter, right? It's not creating a point of friction. Rather, it's creating you know, a more unique, more personalized customer experience. And I think people are getting a little more educated about that as well, and understand that, and are willing to give information as long as it's not obtrusive. So
I agree. And I think the example that you gave when somebody's like, oh, we've ungated everything, I think that's a perfect example of when an organization doesn't know the value of their content or their assets. So, you know, it requires really digging in and finding out what are the most valuable assets. You know, how can you leverage any data that you have on your content performance? You know, what's popular? What are people downloading the most at what stages? You know, do we see that a lot of leads that convert to opportunities, they're all coming back to this one piece of content? So really using that data to make an educated decision into what is your most valuable piece of, or your valuable pieces of content, and where that needs to be throughout the buyer's journey.
yeah, and it also aligns to conversation tracks, right? So you think about, I mean, that's ideally what you're trying to do with that first form is ask something that's going to align with the conversation track architecture that you've put together. Again, so we've talked about that in a previous session. But one of the other thing too is that questions should not only be able to align and you know, give you information so that you can continue to personalize and customize that journey for an individual, but also so that sales can have meaningful conversations. So the questions that you ask, you know, going back to alignment, you know, you're rightly, you know, so that you called out alignment being one of the number one things as funnel management framework. You know, you want to align. It's not just about marketing getting the information that they need to personalize and customize, but it's sales getting the information that they need to have better conversations with prospects once they are ready to talk to sales. So it's twofold, right? I think progressive profiling can be very, very valuable if done right.
Agreed. So then I think the next place that people go in their mind is, okay, so we've got this progressive profiling set up, you know, we know the value of our content, we understand, you know, how to convert our prospects and leads through the buying stages, but how do we know who those, you know, who's ready to buy? How do we know who's in an early stage, how are we tailoring that journey and the conversations to their needs? And that brings me to one of my last points about the funnel management framework, which is lead scoring. This is a big one, a really, really big one.
A hotly debated topic too, I would say.
A very
Different
hotly
forms.
debated topic. Oh yeah. I mean, this is the kind of thing, and you could just go down a rabbit hole with lead. We could do an entire podcast, just on lead scoring. We could do a whole series on lead scoring for that matter. But a basic definition of lead scoring is that it's an objective method to assign values to your leads. So it basically gives structure to the process of qualifying and converting leads. And it really is a core component of any good funnel management framework. So in short, lead scoring models commonly use a point system to score various data points. So anything like demographics, we talked about earlier. So, what are the basic demographics that make up your customer profile, job role, function, geographics, if that's important, company data, what industry is the company, what size is the company, whether it's revenue, employee size, whatever criteria is important to your organization. Online interactions and behavior. So, what's happening on your website? What pages are they visiting? What are they interested in? What are they downloading? Engagement with email and social media. So there's just endless data points that you can look at when you're putting together a lead scoring model. And I don't think anybody on this podcast would debate that it's a really heavy lift to come up with an effective lead scoring model. It's a tall order. There's a lot to consider, and there will most likely be several iterations before you get to a lead scoring model that works for you, and that's okay. I think that's to be expected. Jennifer's shaking her head.
Well, I think critical to the lead scoring model development is getting back to the sales and marketing alignment, right? Ideally, what you want to do is get all of those folks literally in the room together and spend a day whiteboarding out, because in addition to getting alignment on, what's the point threshold to deem somebody sales ready, even within that, using the point values, you can prioritize. So like industry is an easy example. Do you want to give somebody a few more points for being in a key industry? What's the best, the middle, the least favorite? And and even once you reach that alignment at the end of the day and everybody's exhausted and you've learned so much from listening to everybody's opinion, it should be a living, breathing thing. Right? You mentioned analytics and the ability to set all of that up right from the beginning. It's not going to be perfect out the gate. You'll need to tweak it. Things change. The marketplace changes. Your ideal customer target, might change. So there's just all things to consider.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that there's a subjective component to it and then an objective component to it. So having those conversations and getting that subjective feedback from sales, marketing, all the critical stakeholders, but then also looking at analytics, pulling those reports to help you make those decisions is also really important. So I think that was a good point, Jennifer. It's got to be a combination of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing too is about, again, going back to the buying stages, right? Understanding how to map and the content model. I keep bringing it back to, previous conversations, but is aligning your scoring model to, the buying stages and leveraging exponential score thresholds, I think is really important as well, right? Understanding that if somebody's in a passive buying state and they're doing thought leadership, you're not going to score that really high because we know they're in a passive buying stage, right? They're poking around, they're trying to understand and feel out what their challenges are, right? And how those connect potentially to a solution that you might offer. But later on, if people are reading high value, product sheet downloads or things like that, again, that's a high propensity to buy. They're clearly in an active buying stage and very close to sales. So you're going to want to score things like that much higher. So it's almost like that hockey stick progression when it comes to things that are aligned to buying stages or content. And then again, we could go into a whole, like you said, a whole thing about how to align your content and tag and appropriately and things like that. But either way, I think again, it all goes back to that core tenet of the conversation tracks, the buying stages, and the way that the content model aligns to that.
And something else I don't think a lot of people think of when the topic of lead scoring comes up is, everybody thinks about how one accumulates a lead score. How are the individual data points being allotted points to get to that, whatever that threshold is. But people often don't think about the fact that you can subtract points.
I knew you were going there.
And that's an important part of a lead scoring model. What kind of behavior would detract, points from a lead scoring model? You got to think about those things as well. It's kind of a little bit of a safety net to make sure that nobody gets through when you're thinking about, those unwanted behaviors or,
Time decay. Time decay is another one.
Exactly. That's a great one.
Yeah, because somebody was doing something a year ago, all of a sudden they do something today doesn't mean all of a sudden, you have to think about things like that. Yeah. Another thing is where the data points are coming from, right? I think oftentimes people think about their content model, their marketing automation platform, their forms on the website, like you just talked about. But you have to think holistically about your entire tech stack too. There could be other things that they're doing as you integrate all of those data points together in those systems that are really high value interactions that aren't happening on your website or aren't happening with your content or
the offline activities.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you have to really, really take a step back and think holistically, about your engagement channel model and, how all of that works together. Scoring models are fun, but to your point, Jennifer, you definitely need a day of whiteboarding in the office.
Yeah, expect some healthy debate for sure.
You talked, Jen, about earlier, you talked about the roles people play across the funnel management framework. And I think that's really important. We tend to call it customer stewardship, right? But who's responsible for guiding that customer journey throughout throughout those buying stages? So marketing may be responsible earlier in that process. When does the BDR, you talked about the definitions of qualified leads and that conversion process, but when does the BDR actually take that over and what's their responsibility? When do they pass it to sales? What is the charter? It really helps to put together what the charter of those roles are, the BDR, marketing, et cetera. What are they responsible for down to, you talked about the CRM, right? So maybe in Salesforce, the BDR, it's really important for them to be those data stewards to enrich that lead with relevant information as they do their due diligence and research to capture even if it's email or phone preferences. I know that seems remedial, but it's not, right? If you think about, you want that to be a seamless experience so that when marketing hands over, right, you have to, that's what I mean by customer stewardship is marketing's done their due diligence about, to your point, asking the right questions, not over asking, having a two-way conversation with a buyer that's really meaningful, giving them valuable information in return for valuable information. And so they're handing that over when they're ready to talk to a BDR in this, basically on a silver platter. So it's the BDR's responsibility then to, I think about it like a relay race, right? To take that baton and do their due diligence and leverage all of that information to continue the conversation in a meaningful way with that buyer so that you're not creating an unintentional point of friction at that transfer point. Same thing with sales, right? So the BDR has this conversation with them. Let's say that they're continuing that conversation in a meaningful way. The last thing you want to do is hand that over now to a salesperson and have them start over again from scratch and ask questions, right? That's off-putting to a buyer. They've invested in a relationship with your organization from a marketing perspective, content perspective, from a live conversation perspective, right? They expect you to know things about them and they expect you to have a personalized conversation with them. And that's that idea of customer stewardship and why it's really important to clearly define whose role is what and what those transition points look like between roles.
And I appreciate that you brought that point up because I think that a customer, whether you think of it this way or not, a customer is, or a buyer is looking at it as if they are in a relationship with you, even if it's only been online. I mean, we've probably all, read the research and, Gartner reports and all the statistics that show that a buyer is X percentage through the buying process before they ever have a conversation with the salesperson, that doesn't mean there's not a relationship until they have that first conversation. Everything that's happening online, everything that's happening, that you've put out there for them, and all that interaction and all the lead scoring that's happening, that's all building the relationship. So
Yep.
I love the point that you made about not creating friction. Like, don't damage the relationship that you've been working so hard to build. And that really does fall on everyone's shoulder to value that relationship.
Let me introduce you to my best friend. Sorry, she's being a jerk all night.
Right. Exactly. So how do you make sure that you're honoring the relationship, with all these people involved? How do you know that you're doing everything the right way, that you're not waiting to call the best friend, 5 days after you were introduced?
What did you say to him? He's not calling me back anymore.
Right. So how do you do that? What does that look like?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, and you've kind of touched on this before, Jennifer, I think you mentioned it, which is SLAs, right? I think that you need to clearly establish timeframes in which you're going to respond during those transition points. So let's take a BDR, right? That's the biggest, I think, the SLA that people focus on, which is somebody has, again, easiest example. I have filled a form out. I have raised my hand and said, I want to talk to a salesperson. I am ready to have a buying conversation. It is your responsibility. We've all seen, again, to your point, the Gartner research, all the different research points about literally, it's not hours. It's not minutes. They've actually shown research that if you respond in within, I think it's like a minute or 2 minutes like that, versus 10 to 15 minutes, that it's an exponential return on the investment there and the likelihood to close that deal. So it's, understanding the time frame in which the agreed upon response times when a lead hits a certain stage, like a qualified lead during those transition points. Same thing with sales, right? Let's say that a BDR converts a lead over and then transitions that lead into a sales ownership, right? So again, that customer stewardship, now it's in sales primary ownership. It's their responsibility to follow up on that and do their due diligence too. Strictly from a perspective of marketing, to your point, has done all of this work to get that lead in. The BDR has done all of this work to ensure that that's a seamless transition, and that the first human interaction, right, with that person is a good one. So now they have a good, understanding of how that's going to continue. Sales has a responsibility, right? So then if they're not responding to them, all that work is lost, and it's hard. We all know, everybody on this call knows how hard it is to get a real qualified lead, of note from marketing to BDR to it takes a village, right? But that's the point of those SLAs, is it's mutually agreed upon response times, to honor. It's really about the customer, though. It's your responsibility to each other, but it's your responsibility to the customer to make sure that they have the best experience possible. So that's one thing. Second thing is feedback loops. You have to listen to each other. Going back to sales and marketing alignment being, the tenet of the funnel management framework. You can't just launch a new funnel management framework process, train people on a brand new process, which is most likely much more sophisticated, and they have a lot more responsibility in this new process, and then walk away and one and done it. It just doesn't work that way. We've had how many conversations, podcasts, webinars, everything about change management, right? It always comes back to change management, but people are people, and it takes time, and you have to come back around to them. How did that training feel? Is this working? Is this not? To your point about Jennifer, about the scoring model of being a living, breathing
It's a living, breathing thing.
Yeah. If your BDRs are saying, listen, we're getting qualified leads, and I continue to turn these leads back. They are not ready for sales, right? They're your best feet on the ground to get that information to say, okay, let's take a step back and look at the scoring model. Or
absolutely,
if they're not getting a good a volume of leads that's in, maybe you have to tune it to, maybe you're being too aggressive, right? And you have too many stage gates in place around it. But it's the
analytics. It's looking at the data to assess how everything is performing, but it's also that anecdotal information, that feedback loop. Because the analytics, you might be looking at the conversion rates and going, oh my God, the lead to opportunity conversion rates suddenly in the toilet. But to answer the why, often requires that feedback loop. So that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and it did it, and it just continues to work along the idea of sales and marketing alignment and bringing those teams together, right? One team, one fight. I think you, again, in previous conversations, Jennifer, you've always talked about having to sing off the same sheet of music, align around the same KPIs, come together around all of that. That feedback loop really, really does wonders for that process. Because to your point, if you're looking at data, right, and you're starting to have that data-driven mindset, and that really brings people together to not point fingers and say, well, it's sales' fault, it's marketing's fault, but really it's we're all in this together, and it's about the customer and the buyer. It's not about us. So let's figure out how we create the best experience possible for them. That's what we see in a lot of mature organizations. But it's funny because I think a lot of misalignment, right, when we talk about misalignment between sales and marketing teams, one of the things that we keep seeing too is a lot of organizations that are buying technology to solve a process problem, right? And they'll identify a process problem. They know they have a process problem, so they go out and they buy this gigantic tech stack, right? How many times have each one of you started with a brand new client and seen the NASCAR slide of the tech stack, right, that they've got in place, and meanwhile they don't even understand what, to your point, Jen, what the definition of a qualified lead is when a lead comes to them, or how to leverage any information on the page, right? So
I mean,
they don't even know, they can't even explain every element on the tech stack NASCAR slide. They're like, I think we just bought such and such, but I don't know what it does.
How we're using that really. And
I don't know when we're rolling it out. Yeah, I mean, it's great that you brought that up, because it's such a critical component of demand generation in its entirety, but it's particularly important when it comes to building a lead management framework or the funnel management framework, because you truly can't decouple those two things. You can't even start to, well, you can think about it and you can build the process, but you can't operationalize things like your lead qualification stages or your lead scoring, or operationalize how folks are going to move from stage to stage, much less give them the opportunity to move backwards, right? And so having the right pieces of technology and thinking about what those are after you've mapped out the process is really key. I mean, the things that, like I said, the stages and the things like the SLAs, you've got to make sure that you have a robust marketing automation platform. And I'm not going to name names or pick favorites, but there are some that are geared for enterprise organizations and some that are not. And those that are not, the kinds of things that we've been talking about today in terms of the funnel management framework, you kind of have to build with duct tape and glue in the inferior products. No, seriously. I mean, we do it all the time.
I know. I'm just laughing.
Not a lot of fun, but you know what? It's true. Obviously a good CRM system that's not too heavily customized, and the integration between the two. Those are really the two most important things. And then thinking about, things like, Jessica, you brought up, not forgetting offline activities is a huge engagement channel and source of leads. How are you going to make sure that those get into your funnel? How do those engagements kind of systematically, automatically get into your program, right? And do you have a system, whether and typically it's a combination of the marketing automation platform and your CRM system amongst others. Are you able to set up the back end, abilities for data analytics, right? Because if that's not set up from the beginning, it's going to be a huge spaghetti bowl mess. But I mean, I guess the key thing about technology is I think we've said it a million times over our different parts of this series, but you just can't lead with technology, right? It's a big mistake. Lead with process. Think through all the stuff that we've talked about today. Make sure that marketing and sales are aligned, and then, confirm that you have the right tech stack to operationalize all of that.
And make sure it's integrated. To your point, you talked about data models. It's not just to bring the data together, but it's oftentimes, how many times have you guys seen a really valuable piece of technology that's basically standalone within the organization, right? Or it's integrated into the wrong place. Let's say it's integrated into your CRM versus your marketing automation platform, right? So you are losing the opportunity to trigger events or additional points of personalization, right? To improve that buying process. because you don't have the information early enough in the process, right? You're looking at it as a sales piece rather than backing it up around that customer stewardship notion.
And another thing we see a lot is kind of a lack of a single source of truth for demand generation, right? And when you've got system A and system B and the numbers are coming out differently around the supposed same thing, you use the word trust earlier, talking about progressive profiling, but I think it's really important in terms of analytics too, right? If those numbers, if any little thing doesn't match, folks have a tendency to throw out all the numbers and just trust everything. And obviously, having the right tech stack and having those trackers set up correct from the beginning is it's essential.
Yeah, how do you make decisions, right? If you don't have
You can't.
a source of truth and you don't have seamless integrations in your tech stack.
Right.
So what you're saying is you want a good tech stack so that you're not just automating chaos. And Jessica, you're saying that sales and marketing and BDRs, they all have to play nice and be in the same sandbox and be friends.
Amen.
Is that how we were boiling it down here?
Amen.
I think so.
Perfect. Well, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you all so much for your time, and stay tuned for the 5th and final installment soon. Thank you.
Thank you.